Hello, my name's Jason. I'm not an archaeologist, but I do play one on TV. So come join me as we go into the dust.
This show has been brought to you by the letter C.
Hey everyone, okay, I'm back from the holidays, a few pounds heavier, hair is a little bigger. I'm recovering from all that good holiday food, probably like a lot of you are. So anyway, let me exercise my mouth a little and jump right into the ABCs of archaeology. And we are up to C. C is for a very fancy French term called Chaîne Opératoire. And I can actually say it like that because, fun fact, I used to be fluent in French. I lived, worked, and studied in France for quite a while. But that was a long time ago. French is a little rusty. So nowadays,
We do not even have a language, just a stupid accent.
so this term, chaîne opératoire, what does it mean? It translates into English as operating chain, which lacks some of the panache of that French term. So that's why we'll stick with the French term. And it refers to all of the steps in the production process leading up to the creation, the usage, the maintenance, the repair, and finally the throwing away, or the fancy archaeological term for that is the deposition of an artifact. So it sort of takes you through the whole life cycle of the artifact and reviews all the different processes that happen to it. Now, it was first developed by André Leroy-Gorin, a French archaeologist working on prehistoric lithic technology, and he was doing this work in the mid-20th century. Now, fun fact, the name Leroy, also in English we say Leroy, that actually means the king in French. I haven't ever looked up the origin of it, but it could be something like the English version, Fitzroy. Now, Fitzroy was a name that was often given to the bastard or illegitimate sons of the kings. But anyway, that's a little linguistics for you. And our boy Leroy, he actually held positions in museums all over the world, from the British Museum to even places in Japan. Now, fun fact about him, and something close to my heart, is he was actually a fighter for the French resistance, which was based in Lyon, where I actually studied. I lived in a place called Caluire, which is where Jean Moulin, who was actually the head of the French resistance, was captured and, of course, later executed. And the university that I went to there houses the museum to the French resistance. So I kind of gel with this guy already. Now, as I said, what this concept does is it takes the whole life cycle of an object from when it was created to when it finally is thrown away, and it breaks down all the steps very explicitly. Think of it kind of like that children's book, The Little Red Hen, where the little red hen plants the weed and takes care of the weed and harvests the wheat. No one wants to help her do that, but at the end, when she winds up with a loaf of bread, everyone wants to help her eat the bread. Well, we know where that bread eventually is going to end up, and yeah, story of my life. So what would this be useful for? First thing is it gives us some sense of the sophistication of societies. So something simple like an ancient stone tool. All over Europe, they have these things called stone hand axes. Might seem pretty simple. You take a stone and you stick it onto some stick, and there you've got a hand axe. Actually, this shows it's a lot more complicated than that, and I'll get into it. But you see how many different people, processes, and technologies were involved with simply putting a simple artifact like that together. Now, the second thing it also does is it can actually get us inside the heads of those ancient people, which ultimately is what people often find really interesting about archaeology. So it can help us to understand how those people interpreted things, the sense of meaning that the people at that time might have taken away from it. So let's take an example again of that stone hand axe. Seems like a clumsy tool just made by some kind of caveman. Well, what is the axe made out of? What's the stone? Did it come from far away? Let's say it did, because they often did in this case. That meant that those people actually traveled long distances, or they actually had complex trade networks to get that stone from far away to where you find the hand axe. What is it made out of? If it was some carefully selected stone, that means that either that stone has some technical quality that's desirable, like its ability to be shined or its superior hardness for actually breaking stuff. That means these people actually had that kind of technical understanding. Or maybe it's something particularly unusual looking, rare. A lot of times I think they were like jadeite minerals. So that actually tells you something about what these people valued. Maybe there was the economic concept of scarcity, which makes something valuable. Maybe they valued it for its aesthetic quality. So you're beginning to see how much you can actually learn about this just from seeing what the material was and where it came from. So maybe, as is often found, these stone tools didn't really have any practical use at all. So perhaps it had some kind of symbolic value. It represented something, maybe religious, maybe just a status symbol. That tells you something about these societies. Okay, so they get our stone from somewhere, they quarry it, they shape it, polish it. Now they fasten it to a branch. Okay, that's the next step. And let's say you find a lot of these things. That means they had to probably harvest these branches from somewhere, because if they cut down so many trees, you'd eventually have deforestation. So maybe they harvested a certain kind of tree for this sort of branch. And if there was a lot of them and they were traded, that also implies some kind of industrial process. So this kind of industrial activity, think of all the other processes that it entails. It probably entails trade to get these materials together. It probably entails planning to think about the different materials, people, skills you'll need to get together. And it also entails a distribution process. So it's actually quite sophisticated. And maybe the axe has some kind of special carving or etching on it. Who carved it? If it's a highly specialized carving, maybe that means there was another artisan in the process. So this society had sophisticated enough economy to have, artisans who just did things for aesthetic purposes. Maybe they're all very highly individualized markings, which means that this could connote some concept of ownership, or that it belonged to a certain person or clan or class of people. That's a whole other step, opening up even more possibilities. Do we see some kind of evidence of wear, tear, and repair? That tells us about, was it used or not? And if it was repaired, that might mean it was used over a long period of time. And this does happen in sort of real life. Some of these ancient tools have a lot of wear and tear, meaning they were used for chopping something or hitting something. Others do not at all. And from dating and other processes, they can tell they were in use for a long time. They were being handled for a long time. What would something that was handled for a long time but doesn't have any apparent use mean? Again, something symbolic, something ritual, something ornamental. So how were these axes eventually disposed of? All over northwestern Europe, you find weapons and valuables from ancient times deposited in water. What could this say? Maybe those things, especially if they have those individual markings, were tied to individual people. And when that person died, the object was put to rest. If you find lots of valuable stuff in water, that probably means the water had some kind of a sacred symbolic meaning. And actually, this is exactly what happened all over northwestern Europe. And it's actually where the concept of a wishing well comes from, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So there you have it, Chaîne Opératoire. You could see how powerful this is, even with something relatively simple like a stone tool. And if you want a really complicated example, let's take another stone, Stonehenge. Those stones, some of them were locally quarried. Some of them were quarried all the way from Wales, dozens of miles away. They had been erected in other stone circles long before Stonehenge came around. They were brought across the country. Then, as I said, the locally quarried stones were erected. There were people buried around there. They were changed a few times. So that's a really complex chaîne opératoire. and the thing still exists today, so I guess it was never disposed of in any way. All right, well, anyway, we can play this game all day. Why don't we, for fun, you can look around your house, figure out what the Chaîne Opératoire was of, I don't know, this. It's a game we can all play. It tells you a lot about ancient societies. So, C for Chaîne Opératoire.
Broadcasting live from somewhere underneath the ground. Archaeology News. The news you can trust.
Hey everyone, welcome to the second edition of the Archaeology News. And as you're probably aware if you occasionally watch the news, DNA is just creating new headlines every day. And in my world, that's ancient DNA. And the first story is about just that. So, there was a study done of some 1,617 ancient genomes, 317 of those from Europe, and the remainder from Eurasia. These were compared with 410,000 genomes and other personal information profiles of white British individuals. And you'll understand why that's important in a moment. These are modern individuals. And in it, there were some startling findings about multiple sclerosis. Now, if you don't know what multiple sclerosis is, this is a disease that affects the nervous system, heavily women by a 4-to-1 ratio, and typically after the age of 30. There are some pretty recognizable people who have the disease, and it's mostly women, but not exclusively. And believe it or not, this terrible disease, at least according to the conclusions of this study, seems to come from something that was once an adaptive evolutionary advantage. So how on earth could that be? So here we go. The modern European population is comprised of 6 distinct different genetic populations that all came into Europe. But for now, to simplify things, we're going to focus on 3 of them. The first, some 45,000 years ago, were Asian hunter-gatherers. So they came from the east and they settled into Europe. 9,000 years ago, there were farmers. So this was the beginning of sort of the Neolithic period from the Middle East. And then 5,000 years ago, there were a pastoralist population. So those mean shepherds, people who reared animals, from what's called the Eurasian steppe. That's Western Russia and present-day Ukraine. These were called the Yamnaya people, so the Yamnaya culture. So this latter group, the Yamnaya people, they went all over the place, again, had a big influence on modern languages, but they seem to have stayed more and have had the strongest influence in Northern Europe. So the people in Northern Europe sort of bear more of their traits. Tall, light in complexion, blue-eyed. These are generally understood to be traits inherited by the Yamnaya. Incidentally, the descendants of the Middle Eastern farming population that came in 9,000 years ago before the Yamnaya, well, they are more firmly ensconced in Southern Europe, which is why to this day, people in Southern Europe are darker in complexion and shorter than people in Northern Europe. However, Europeans tend to have these 3 populations in their genetic background just to varying degrees. So, scientists from Cambridge University took that sampling of ancient DNA, the 1,617, 317 of those from ancient Europeans, and 1,300 of them from Eurasians. These are people who lived anywhere from 3,000 to 11,000 years ago. And what they did is they compared those genomes to that big bank of modern white British people, that 410,000 people. And they did that because, as we know, Europe today is a very diverse place with a lot of people who have immigrated relatively recently. What we were looking for in this study is people who have their long, deep roots in Europe without a lot of other external influences. And here's where MS, multiple sclerosis, comes in. So this is a disease that affects predominantly European people. They are much more likely to have this than other populations in the world, and particularly people from Northern Europe, where that Yamnaya blood is strong. So MS is caused essentially by an overactive immune system.
The force is strong in this way.
That then acts to attack its own neuron cells. In the context of Yamnaya pastoralists who are constantly around their animals, this was actually a benefit. Think about mad cow disease. That's a really deadly neurological disease if humans catch it. The adaptation to have this overactive immune system attacking a neurological disease spread by animals would have actually been a benefit for these people in constant contact with animals. And in that sense, it was probably an adaptive advantage for them. Unfortunately, the downside is MS. But I know what you're thinking. If this genetic predilection actually wound up causing MS, wouldn't natural selection have caused the people carrying these genes to die off? Well, not so fast. Remember how natural selection works. Mother Nature does not care if you live a long time, does not care if you're comfortable, doesn't care if you're happy. The way natural selection works is those members of a species and species who are better adapted to reproduce, they're the ones whose genetic material survives, and that influences their descendants. Remember, MS primarily strikes people who are above the age of 30, and even 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, that was long after most women gave birth to their first child. Thinking about thousands of years ago, that first child probably came to a lot of women in their younger and mid-teens, long before the appearance of MS. So from the point of view of evolution, once you've had that baby, that's all we care about, not what happens after. And hence, there's much more MS in Europe and Northern Europe, where the Yamnaya left their strongest stamp on the population. This reminds me of another study from 2022, so not that long ago, which discussed an area in present-day Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia, where historical accounts seem to point to a terrible pestilence that struck the area in the 14th century. Archaeologists actually excavated 2 cemeteries in this region from 1885 to 1892, and believe it or not, material still exists from those excavations somewhere. And it turns out a number of the graves in these cemeteries actually attested specifically to the deaths of these people being caused by a terrible pestilence in 1338 and 1339. So what present-day scientists did is actually sequence the genomes of 7 people from these cemeteries with the inscriptions, and it actually found the genetic imprint of what would later become the Black Death. So they actually identified the birthplace of the Black Death from this little area in Kyrgyzstan. That's the culprit. Absolutely amazing. One more historical mystery solved thanks to archaeology, specifically ADNA. And as you know, archaeology is a discipline that covers an incredible range of material, from stuff as tiny as DNA, now to something much, much bigger. I'm going to talk about a recent LIDAR survey. LIDAR stands for Light Detection and Ranging. First developed in the 1960s, the use of LIDAR in archaeology really came to fruition in the 2000s as the technology became cheaper and lighter, and hence could be deployed off of even smallish drones. Now, what LIDAR does is these lasers
Begin laser ignition sequence.
Begin laser ignition!
are sort of strong enough to penetrate forest cover and topsoil to map things below the ground. Now, how does that work? Essentially, the LIDAR system can calculate the time and then hence translate that into distance that it takes for that laser beam to bounce back to the drone if it's being deployed from a drone. And the result of that, this sort of time distance calculations, is sort of an elevation map of those features underneath the ground. And you'll see lots of examples of this as we talk. Now, this has been a gold mine for the practice of archaeology in many ways. And one of the key ways is it's essentially resource saving. So long ago, as in like 10 years ago, or even sometimes now when there isn't the ability to use LIDAR, archaeologists would have to do a ground survey and try to find the place where they thought there was stuff to be found. And a lot of times this was a lot of guesswork and very hit or miss. Well, now using LiDAR, they have a pretty good idea where the stuff is that they're looking for. So it actually makes digging much more efficient, a lot lower failure rate if you already know that there's something under there. And this is so important because archaeology is resource starved. And though archaeologists love to dig, the money is often just not there for it. Anyway, like just about every oversexed archaeology story that breaks into the headlines nowadays, this story involves LiDAR changing everything we know about the course of history. Archaeologists are left perturbed, astounded, puzzled. Yeah. Let's just get to the story. So, the Ecuadorian government conducted a LiDAR survey of an area called the Upano Valley that's in the center of the country in an area of the Amazon, that vast rainforest in the tropics of South America. Now, from the looks of the photos, it looks like some of this area has been deforested, unfortunately, which, as we know, happened already to much of the Amazon. And what they found was astounding. This was an area about 300 square kilometers or about 115 square miles. So, what did they find? They found over 6,000 platforms, and subsequently targeted excavations of these revealed that some of them were probably houses, while some of them seemed to be used for other public or, dare we say, ritual purposes. They found 15 distinct settlements home to at least 10,000 people, but probably a lot more. It's very difficult to tell without extensive excavations, and even with excavations, there's a lot of guesswork involved. Now, these settlements were linked by roads, straight roads, wide roads, some of them as wide as 10 meters or 33 feet, and long roads, some as long as 16 miles or over 25 kilometers. Now, the fact that these roads were straight tells us some important things. Remember, it's a lot harder to build a straight road than it is one that just sort of naturally follows the contours of the land. This means these people had understanding of sort of advanced construction, engineering, and mathematical techniques, which is pretty amazing considering the age of the site. Carbon dating suggests that these sites were built about 2,500 years ago and were inhabited for about 1,000 years. So we're basically overlapping totally with the Roman period, meaning there was a civilization in South America that had advanced road building techniques at that time in the Amazon forest. Now, also, they found some evidence of defensive works. So what we're seeing is massive public engineering and construction projects. Unbelievable. All of this points to the existence of this previously unknown sophisticated civilization that could build these massive things. Imagine it's basically like a Maya or Aztec or Inca civilization unknown sitting beneath the Amazon forest. This is particularly surprising given the supposed consensus prior to these findings that there was really no large-scale settlements in the Amazon region in ancient times. It was thought that there were just small groups of people who didn't leave much of a trace. It was also a particular personal triumph for one Professor Stéphane Rostin, who's the Director of Investigation at the National Center for Scientific Research in France. He had found evidence decades ago of these settlements on the ground doing archaeology, but he was warned not to pursue this line of investigation considering that so-called consensus. And so in challenging it, that would be career suicide. So what did he do? Like any good archaeologist, he continued to look for this civilization like a dog with a bone and challenge that consensus. So you know what they say, if at first you don't succeed, try, and try again. And that's just what he did, culminating in this study. Personally, what I'd be interested to know is, these Upano people, did they clear the forest? In other words, at the time this civilization flourished, was the area forested or was it cleared, and to what extent was it cleared? The reason I ask this is previously different lines of archaeological evidence have actually upended similar assumptions in a place like Britain, where LIDAR, archaeobotany, and other things have led us to understand that the island was not always just this mass forested place until the Industrial Revolution. It was not just like Sherwood Forest or something. And as I previously mentioned on the show, the island actually had experienced periods of changing vegetation, and reforestation. So I'm curious to know what this region of the Amazon looked like over time. Anyway, this is all thanks to our good friend LIDAR.
Now, that's a good thing.
Okay, so this last story is from the middle of last year, but in the world of academic publishing, that's like a nanosecond. And it concerns my research anyway, and I've been writing about it, so we're going to do it because it's my show. This concerns early medieval Britain, also known as the Dark Ages, also known as the Anglo-Saxon period. Why did it get these names? Well, it's called the Dark Ages because there's almost nothing written about it. In fact, there are really just two sources. One is written by a pretty mad monk named Gildas, who's writing a religious polemic. The other is a longer and more carefully written account that does claim to be a history, written by a guy called the Venerable Bede, who's considered Britain's first historian. Now, according to Bede, after the Romans evacuated Britain, there was groups of people called Anglos and Saxons and also Jutes who moved into England, conquered the place, and that's also what Gildas said. He sort of intimated that there was a mass slaughter and these Anglo-Saxons conquered the people there and pushed them further west into places like Wales and Scotland. But we know it's actually a lot more complicated than that. What caused all these Anglo-Saxons coming from places like northern Germany and southern Denmark? What made them decide to come to Britain and snap up all this cheap real estate? Don't know. How did they come and do this? Were they conquerors, really? Were they peaceful migrants? There's been some suggestions that they actually didn't really come in large numbers and that the locals just sort of adopted their culture through trade or some other means, kind of the same way that, let's say, people from the former Soviet Union adopted Western fashions at the end of the Cold War. And in fact, Bede himself mentions a lot more people other than the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes who came. He mentioned the Bructeri, the Rugi, the Frisians, the Old Saxons, and it's not really clear who all these folks were. We know they generally came from the North Sea zone, from southern Scandinavia and northern Germany. But were they political entities? Were they distinct ethnicities? Did they see themselves as those people, or were those just titles condoned on them later by people like Bede? We don't know. Did this happen because of a vanguard of high-status conquering men who were then followed by their families? Or did we have the settling of whole families of peasants? We just don't know. So you get the picture. There's a lot we don't know, and there's a reason it's called the Dark Ages. So there you go. Well, what we do have in spades is thousands and thousands of burials on both sides of the English Channel from this period. And there was one particular item which is the subject of this study I'm going to discuss. And that are these small ivory rings which are found at the hips of women in their burials. And these ivory rings were probably like holders for bags at the women's belts. Now, for a long time, this was just taken for granted as an accessory. Like at that time, there was something called girdle hangers. And that was it. It was assumed they were probably made out of walrus tusk ivory or something else in the area. Well, some smart applications of scientific techniques has changed all of this thinking. A group of researchers, and I'll point out that the first one listed as an author, Katie Himmer, is at UCL where I study as a bioarchaeologist. They applied scientific techniques, particularly three, that produce some astounding results. First, Radiocarbon dating confirmed that the ivory rings themselves were from the 5th and 6th centuries, so reasonably contemporaneous with the burials, not some ancient artifact or something. Second, strontium analysis, which is something I discussed in the B is for bioarchaeology episode, that confirmed that the source of this ivory, so where the animals were from, was actually probably in East Africa, so nowhere near any of these people. Third and finally, mass spectrometry, a complex process that I don't totally understand and certainly can't fully explain, but here goes. It essentially measures the mass to charge ratio of ions, and apparently different species will sort of leave a different signature in this regard. And in this case, the material was, I believe, collagen from the ivory. I think that was the case. And it turns out that the signature that the mass spectrometer produced matched that of elephants. So wow, the implications of this are amazing. Let's put it all together for a moment. What this means is that somebody killed some elephants in East Africa, probably Ethiopia, and rings made from the ivory somehow made their way to Britain and northern Germany, because there are rings found there, just not quite as many as in England. In England, I think they found something like 70 plus of these. Now, some other findings. Archaeology suggests that these rings were probably imported in their finished form into Britain because the technology for working ivory and polishing and all of that was in abundance in the Mediterranean. It's also unlikely that the rings made it directly from Africa or the Mediterranean into Britain and Germany. They probably passed through a complex trade network to get there. So what this means is Britain, which was at the time considered a poor backwater at the edge of the earth, had something valuable enough to trade for ivory rings, and that there were trade networks that linked it. That really flips the script, and it introduces this sort of commerce at such an early stage in the development of what would later become England. Moreover, there's a lot more that can be learned. Assuming ivory rings in Germany come up with similar results, and we should test just to be sure, that would actually allow us to link specific communities on both sides of the channels. So origin communities in northern Germany and destination communities in England. Secondly, if we test the DNA and the strontium and all of that from the bodies associated with this ivory, that will tell us a lot about how these people came to England and transmitted their culture. Were they immigrants from Germany? The DNA and strontium could tell that. Were they Germanic people who were now second or third generation? The DNA and strontium would tell us that. Are they actually mixed people? So the result of unions between native Britons and immigrants? Or are these merely Britons who adopted a Germanic fashion trend? Because Germany to this day remains a fashion powerhouse. Didn't you know?
So now's the time on Sprockets when we dance.
Why this is also important is because to this day there remains some big unanswered questions, producing an often spirited and sometimes downright nasty debate.
If I did not get these queens to sign a peace deal soon, I would not become famous.
Who were these Anglo-Saxons? Where exactly did they come from? Were they conquerors or were they settlers? These are all questions that remain unanswered, and incidentally, this will probably be the focus of my future doctoral thesis. So, this does shed light on a lot of these questions, and science, especially aDNA and strontium, is beginning to do that. So these ivory rings are just one more piece of the puzzle that really can, for the first time, link specific communities on both sides of the channel and tell us something about the nature of their settlement in Britain. As you can see, all this science stuff really jazzes me up, even though I can't do it at all. And if you like this sort of content, I'd recommend you check out one site, and they have social media, called IFL Science, or I Love Science. They have great content, and I think you should check it out if you like this story. All right, so that's what I've got for you today. Ancient DNA, LIDAR, and ivory rings, all brought to you by Archaeological Science, which, as you can see, is producing some amazing results. All right, signing off. Welcome to the latest edition of our Living Archaeology Site Visit series, and today I'm going to be introducing you to one of the more bizarre sites I've ever visited in one of the more obscure countries. Now, we're going to be talking about Lepenski Vir, a Neolithic site in Serbia. Serbia is right at the heart of Europe, but it's actually very little visited. I think probably due to some of the geopolitical isolation of the country as a result of the terrible events and the wars in the Balkans in the 1990s. Now, in general, the Balkans is getting a lot more visited. I've been there a few times, but at the top of most people's itineraries would be Croatia, Slovenia, and increasingly Albania and Montenegro. Serbia is usually not on the itinerary. I've been to places as random as Uzbekistan, Djibouti, but never have I been to a place where I had fewer expectations than Serbia. I just hadn't heard much about it and knew very few people who've been there. However, that said, Serbia, the northeastern part of Serbia, and this site totally blew me away. So I'm going to be talking to you more about it. Now, this is classified as one of the oldest urban sites in Europe, and maybe the first. Now, we have to use the term urban pretty liberally, given how small scale the site is. I think at no time were there more than a couple hundred people living there. That said, it is very old and it is very strange. The site is located in Đerdap National Park, about a 2 hours drive due east of Belgrade, the capital. That said, the roads are really good and flat, so it's an easy drive. Đerdap National Park is on the southern shore of the Danube River, which starts in Germany and empties out in Ukraine. During that journey, it flows through 10 countries and 4 national capitals. So this is on the southern bank of the Danube in Serbia, and right across the way is Romania. Now, in the park, you'll find the Iron Gates, a particularly scenic stretch of the river with limestone cliffs on both sides. The park is great for hiking and trails, and there's quite a bit to see there. Also in the park, you'll find Trajan's plaque, named after the Roman Emperor Trajan. This was sort of a billboard advertising Rome's power, as this site was once the frontier of the empire, and so it was sort of warning to the barbarians beyond Rome's borders of their power. You'll also find majestic Golubac Fortress, perched right on the riverside very majestically. Built in the 14th century, it was occupied at various times by the Ottomans, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there's quite a bit of history there, and Serbia does have a very turbulent history. Now, some of the sites, including Lepenski Vir, which we'll be talking about, and Trajan's plaque, had to be moved up because the river was flooded by a dam project in the 1970s. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. However, we're going back much further than that. 6,000 years before Rome was even a thing. That's when our site, Lepenski Vir, was abandoned. Weird's the word, and there's quite a few things that make this site very unique. It was first occupied probably at 9,000 BC, that's the earliest dating evidence, for almost 4,000 years until about 6,000 BC. And it contained about 130 to 140 different houses, but that wasn't all concurrently. So at any given time, the size of the village fluctuated. At its peak, it might have been a few hundred people living there. But it's hard to tell because the houses were built and rebuilt again, sometimes right on top of the other or overlapping. So it's a bit of a messy site given the long time frame of occupation. One of the things that makes the site so exciting is it's one of the few places you can see the transition from Mesolithic to Neolithic, from hunter-gatherer to farmer. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, it's located by a particularly oxygen-rich portion of the river, probably because this turbulent portion of the river has a lot of eddies that will make sort of different subclimates, underwater climates in the river. It's also surrounded by dense forests, so that's perfect for hunting and fishing. However, as agriculture was introduced, even though there's a very steep and sheer topography to the place, there's certain sort of geological features and features of the rock that cause this particular location to retain the soil well. In other words, not to be eroded into the river. And that proved to be very, very beneficial for agriculture. So this was a pretty ideal location to sustain a small village. And it's also pretty much accepted that there were some small out settlements that have not yet been found and probably won't be because the site was flooded. But you can understand why people lived there for so long. And again, very rare to find this because hunter-gatherers are usually nomadic. They often didn't stay in one place. And if they did, it's hard to find traces of that. Continuing with the oddity, even despite its age, the village seems to have had a sustained and kind of regular layout in a horseshoe shape, arrayed with the houses facing the river around what appears to be a central and communal space. So, was this a very, very early attempt at zoning and urban planning? Was this a way to use the land efficiently given the small space? There's even some suggestion that given that small space and given the fact that the village never grew to a certain size, there may have been a birth control sort of policy in place to keep it from being overpopulated and outgrowing the resources in this tight area. However, the houses themselves are what's really bizarre. And when I talk about the houses, it's important to note that what I'm talking about is the last phase of development for the village, which started around 6300 BC. And that's what you can see today if you go there. We have to realize how durable these houses were. The floors were made out of a mixture of ash, dung, limestone. It created a concrete-like surface that survives even today. And when you compare that to the big cardboard McMansions you'll see on all those HGTV shows, it makes you think these people were at least perhaps more advanced than we were in that sense. Anyway, for archaeologists, house floors are kind of the jackpot because it shows you how the house was laid out and often what activities were done in the house. And there's often remains, even microscopic, on the floors of the house that tell you a lot about people, what they ate, where they slept, maybe even some of the diseases or sicknesses they had. So a house floor, when you can find it intact, is really valuable. And what's so strange is the houses, though they varied greatly in size, all had a regular trapezoidal shape that's not been seen anywhere. And for a long time, the archaeologists were puzzled as to what this could mean. There didn't seem to be any functional purpose in shaping a house like this. And it wasn't until one day when the archaeologists who excavated the place, and more about them later, looked up and they saw the sun, I believe, rising over Treskavat Peak. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's a mountain across the river in Romania. And with the sun behind that mountain, they realized it was the same trapezoidal shape. And with the sun behind it, it was very clear. So the people who built this village seem to have designed their house in that shape. And this must have somehow been part of their religious practice or belief system. What's on the floor of each house is also uniform and difficult to explain. So in the center, there's a rectangular hearth built of stone blocks. Now, that this is a hearth is pretty beyond argumentation because there's lots of evidence for burning, and every house has that. In front of that hearth is a sort of rectangular depression, which might be some kind of altar or like a receptacle for a libation. And nobody really knows what it is, other than it could be, something for a ritual purpose. And behind the hearth is another sort of stone area, which seems to be a shrine of some sort. And on that shrine are these truly bizarre river stones, which are carved with faces in them that look partially human and partially like fish. And again, there's no explanation for this other than it must be some sort of ritual or spiritual purpose to that. So yeah, ritual. And these stone heads, these mysterious fish-like stone heads, are said to be the oldest monumental sculptures in Europe. Finally, beneath the homes are often found human burials. And in many of these, the skull is disarticulated or buried separately from the body, and those are exclusively male. On the other hand, they often find jaw bones, mandibles, but those are exclusively female. So I don't know, maybe the men didn't want their wives talking shit about them even in death? Not much is known about how these houses actually appeared, but there's some evidence that they developed over time, with the earlier phases just sort of being covered with a tent-like structure. And after that, there's some large stones that indicate supports for a more substantial structure. And behind the village, there's a burial ground and a midden, which is sort of a fancy term for a garbage dump. So how was this site discovered? Like so many amazing archaeological sites, the terracotta warriors come to mind, by a farmer. There was a farmer named Milosevic, no relationship to the maniacal genocidal dictator, but he found some remains, I think, in 1960. And then the site was first looked at by an archaeologist in 1965. Not much happened until 1965, when the archaeologist Dragoslav Srejovic secured the funding to excavate. He led the project along with archaeologist Zagorka Letica. Now, I know I probably butchered those names, so apologies. The project lasted 6 years until 1971, as the archaeologists just kept finding more and more layers of stratigraphy, in this case, floor houses, representing thousands of years of occupation. But there was a big impetus to get the project done, because the whole thing was about to be flooded by a big hydroelectric dam project. Because of that project, the whole site, the whole big block of earth, had to be moved up about 30 meters or 100 feet above the original situation. Same with Trajan's plaque, which I mentioned earlier. That's pretty controversial, because even though the site was preserved, it's not in situ, it's not in its original location, which is what you're supposed to do with archaeology. But this is an example where archaeology was heading for a head-on collision with a clear economic interest. And in that case, although the site is preserved, the economic interest took precedence. That's kind of a big no-no. So there's a suggestion that's why this was not nominated and to this day is not a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I find that a little bit hard to believe, because there's a very famous Egyptian temple complex that I'm sure you'd recognize that I visited some years ago, called Abu Simbel. Now, that was the same thing was done to that. It was moved up as the Nile was dammed, happened at a very similar time. That was in 1968. And Abu Simbel is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So why Lepenski Vir is not, I'm not totally sure. However, there is some particular controversy with Lepenski Vir's being moved, because there are claims that it was done in kind of a shoddy way, with some of the concrete floors crumbling in transit, and claims that not the whole site was excavated. That may possibly be because I believe this was done by then the government of Yugoslavia, which may have lacked some of the expertise. When Egypt, which is sort of an archaeological theme park, moved Abu Simbel, they had a lot of international help and a lot of experience with archaeology. Anyway, once the site was reassembled in the higher location, it was developed for tourism, and a glass housing was built over it to protect the site. Research continued, and in the year 2018, the journal Nature published a few articles about the site. Remember, it was really first excavated and studied in the 60s and 70s, so quite a lot had advanced since then. One of these was a better techniques around radiocarbon dating, and new tests on samples of human and animal bone and charcoal yielded a starting date for the site at 9,900 BC, which was significantly earlier than previously thought. And it helped delineate several distinct phases in the site. Then, as part of a big human genome ancient DNA project in southeastern Europe taking place, it was determined that the original Mesolithic population of Lepenski Vir faced an incoming wave of migrants at the start of the Neolithic period. And at this time, the 8th millennium BC, it seemed these two populations mixed. And that's different than what happened in other parts of Europe with this population wave of migrants, where it seems that the two populations live separately, and in different areas, one killed the other out. Here we have an apparent mixing between the two populations. And it suggested that that's what sort of started the mixing and creation of a new culture, which is what we're seeing in the 7th millennium BC in the form of these weird trapezoid houses and the strange fishmen heads. So that's what gave birth to this unique culture, a mixing of two genetically distinct populations, which presumably had very different traditions. Also in 2014, some archaeoastronomers surveyed the site, and they found an interesting finding, which is that Trescovat Peak, that one where the archaeologists think that's the explanation for the trapezoid shape of the floor houses. Well, these archaeoastronomers said that Trescovat Peak on the summer solstice has a double sunrise. So the sun rises, passes behind the mountain, and continues to rise. And that double sunrise is the reason for the location of the village at this particular spot. Now, I'm a little skeptical of that because you often hear arguments about this site being built this way or in this place because of a solstice or an eclipse, some reason like that. And oftentimes it turns out to be something else. I'd have to hear the full range of arguments about the location of the site in relation, let's say, to other resources and other practical reasons before I'm fully convinced. The site is interesting enough to merit a visit by itself, but the on-site museum, unlike some of those in Belgrade, actually does the subject matter lots of credit. So it's probably, even if you're very slow and considered, shouldn't take you more than 2 hours to see the whole thing, but probably more like 60 to 90 minutes. There's a lot of the artifacts on site. So some of those fishmen, the bones, the pottery, they have a fair amount of the material there, which is a nice touch. It's not like many other places, like, for example, in certain sites of Greece, like Mycenae, where all the stuff is carted off and put in the National Museum. You will see some of the stuff in the National Museum in Belgrade, but you see plenty on site. And the glass structure that they've built over is a nice touch because it's protective over the site, protecting it from the elements. But it does give you a chance to see the natural situation. Now, we know, of course, it's not in exactly the same spot because that spot has been flooded due to the hydroelectric dam. But it gives you a sense of this spot overlooking the river and with the mountains across, which is where the houses supposedly got their shape from. So all in all, it's a really kind of nice ambiance. Now, the layout of the site is really cool. It's in an amphitheater-like setting, so you can see it from above, below, all around, and you can see very clearly the horseshoe-shaped kind of layout of the village. You also see the stratigraphy, different, the floor plans, those trapezoidal house floors on different levels, all of the same phase, but I suppose there are some that are not contemporaneous with each other. So it really is a good way to see the archaeology quite clearly. For this archaeologist, that was a plus. There's also a pretty quirky video, one of the more memorable site videos I've ever seen. It's a mixture of strange music, videos of the actual excavation, some of the archaeologists kind of fooling around, and some other long, draggy scenes that are, I guess, supposed to make you think about what, I'm not sure. But I'll show you some of that a little bit later.
Ispod same površine otkriveno je naselje starijeg neolita sa materijalom već dobro poznate starčevačke kulture. U zemunicama i kolibama od blata našli smo glinene posude raznih oblika i figurine domaćih životinja koje su verovatno imale religiozni značaj. Ovdje smo otkrili i ovu žrtvenu vazu izuzetno.
Slušajući valjda samo sopstvenu intuiciju, Srejović je odlučio da ide dalje u dubinu. Bio je to sudbonosan dan.
Lepenski Vir plus some of the other sites in the region, like at Durdap, make for a nice 3 or 4 day road trip. I definitely recommend a visit to Goljubak Fortress and take a boat ride down the river. On that boat tour, you can see some of the other sites like Trajan's plaque. There's also this really cool giant stone carved head of an ancient Romanian king. He's a local folk hero who defied the Romans till the bitter end. He was eventually captured and killed, but he was a sign of local resistance and someone in the consciousness of the Romanian people. I was the only non-Serbian on the boat tour, and I actually had my own special English guide, one-on-one. His dad was the captain of the boat. He was very professional for his age. I based myself in the village of Donji Milanovac, about a 15-minute drive to the east. That's full of little guest houses. I myself stayed with a family with a few kids, learned a lot about the locals. Most of the people living there have local roots or just across the river in Romania, so it was quite a good experience. And at $30 to $40 a night, maybe 50, it was also cheap as chips, very comfortable. You also have to try this restaurant called Restaurant Varnica. It's in this strange structure overlooking the river. I believe that's kind of an old signal station when this was an important navigational point. And you get an excellent view with some great river fish. That was really one of a kind and also very, very affordable. About 45 minutes east of Donji Milanovac, there's some other cool sites. There's another old Ottoman fort, and there's some, not much to see, but you can see some of the pilings that are remnants of what was Trajan's Bridge. Now, that was a bridge the Romans built to give their soldiers easy access to the other side of the river, the now Romanian side, when they were conquering the whole area. Ironically, those same Romans tore that bridge down when they were in full retreat as the barbarians were on the march. I think that was in the 4th or 5th century. Kind of ironic, isn't it? When the Romans build that bridge to conquer, they're pacifying. When the other folks come back to conquer, they're pillaging, and that makes them barbarians. Everybody got that? Not far from Trajan's Bridge is a very well-preserved Roman fort named Diana. I'm not sure why the feminine name. It sounds to me kind of like what people would name their boats. But anyway, it was a good visit, free. You'll have to be careful, though. While I was there, I was attacked and nearly killed by some ferocious wild dogs. And one thing you'll appreciate about Lepenski Vir, other than the cheap, I think it was $4 entry fee, is the site was open quite late, like 8 or 9 o'clock. That was great for me because it gave me the whole day to see the sites in the region. And don't you just hate it how so many museums close at 5? So that was really appreciated. A bit further afield, about an hour southeast of Donji Milanovac, down some really rough roads, you'll find the 14th century Vratna Monastery. While atmospheric, the real draw here are 3 huge natural arches, obtainable by a short and very scenic hike. And about an hour south of there, although quicker if you're driving directly from Donji Milanovac, you'll find the wine villages of the Negotin wine region. There are a few of these villages, but I visited Roglievo and Ryak. Again, I'm probably mispronouncing those. But these 2 wine villages were really cool. They were living historical and archaeological sites in and of themselves. You see, wine has been grown and produced here since the Roman times, and they have these unique wine cellars which are built into the earth, sort of underneath or beside their houses, kind of like little hobbit holes. So it's a very, very long tradition of winemaking. However, during communist times, a lot of the knowledge was lost, and a lot of the wine you'll find there is cloyingly sweet, kind of like Robitussin or Manischewitz, if you're familiar with kosher wine. However, I, by chance, met a group of Serbian emigres who had left during the communist years to go to Italy, and they had learned proper winemaking, which they then brought back to them, to this region where their roots were. So actually, there were some pretty decent wines, a very unique Merlot that I had. So watch this space as these wines get better and maybe more appreciated on the international scene. I stayed in an old manor house in Rajak, built during the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The owner was from the original family, so it was her family that built the place. Now, she didn't speak a lick of English. I don't speak any Serb, but we somehow made it work. Body language, jumping up and down, and oh yeah, Google Translate. And this I can't take any credit for because it was totally by dumb luck. But I happened to go there during the annual wine festival, which is only one day, I believe, of the neighboring village, Rogljevo. So my Italian Serb friends that I met by chance, they brought me around. We sampled the wine, listened to the music, played games. And other than a couple of Germans and maybe an Italian and a few Russians I met there, I was like the only foreigner. So it was a really cool experience. One of those things you can't plan, you can't pay money for, but which you will never forget. Totally unique touristic experience. Now, I don't remember much of what happened after 11:30 p.m. So let's just say what happens in Rogljevo stays in Rogljevo. So overall, I highly recommend a visit to Lepenski Vir and its surroundings in this northeastern corner of the country. For a compact, affordable, well-organized, interesting museum and a totally sui generis site, Lepenski Vir is definitely worth a visit. Now, slight demerits for moving the whole site out of its original context, some of the degradation that caused to the houses, although you don't see that, and some of the flooding of the original houses that are now below the water, it gets slight demerits, but I'd still give it like a 4.5 out of 5. Not a lot of foreign visitors go to this place, so why don't you become the next visitor? I doubt many of your friends will have seen it. So check it out, Lepenski Vir in Serbia, Đerdap National Park. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.